At 0200 hours on February 2, 2026, a silence hung over the Kursk border region that was more terrifying than the noise of artillery. To the average infantryman, silence usually meant safety. But to the Ukrainian electronic warfare crews monitoring the spectrum, this silence was a screaming alarm. They were hunting ghosts. Specifically, they were hunting the Rubikon Center for Advanced Unmanned Systems, an elite Russian unit that had fundamentally changed the physics of the drone war. For months, Rubicon operators had been deploying a weapon that defied every countermeasure in the NATO handbook: fiber-optic drones. Unlike standard quadcopters that scream their location across the radio spectrum, a fiber-optic drone unspools a physical thread of glass as it flies, tethered to its operator like a diver to a boat. No radio signals to jam, no GPS to spoof. No electronic footprint for a sensor to lock onto. To the sophisticated listening stations meant to detect radio frequencies, these drones were simply invisible, holes in the data where a killer should be. But while the drones were ghosts, the men flying them were made of flesh and bone. And they had just made a fatal assumption. They believed that because their weapons were invisible, their base was too. Unknown to the Rubicon commanders, celebrating their recent successes in the officers' mess, a different kind of math was being calculated 50 kilometers away. A Ukrainian Shark-class reconnaissance drone had been loitering in the freezing stratosphere, battling crosswinds and icing sensors to maintain a fix on a nondescript industrial complex near the village of Suja. The complex looked like any other logistics hub. Trucks moving in, crates moving out. But the thermal signature told a different story. The heat blooming from the ventilation systems wasn't consistent with a warehouse. It was consistent with a server farm or a command center running high-performance computing clusters 24 hours a day. Intelligence had engaged in a weeks-long game of pattern recognition, tracking the rotation of high-value vehicles that never appeared on logistics manifests. They weren't tracking the drones, they were tracking the ego of the commanders. The Rubicon unit, confident in their technological superiority, had grown comfortable. They parked their specialized command vehicles in the same spots. They ran their generators at the same times. And at 0215 hours, the pattern confirmed what the electronic silence suggested. This wasn't just a supply depot. This was the brain of the beast. The decision to strike wasn't made lightly because the Rubicon Center wasn't just a military target, it was a research facility filled with Russia's most capable drone engineers. Eliminating it wouldn't just stop a few attacks, it would decapitate the development program for the most dangerous tactical weapon on the front. But the window of opportunity was closing fast. The thermal feed from the Shark drone showed a convoy of heavy transport trucks idling in the courtyard, their exhaust plumes glowing white-hot against the frozen ground. The unit was packing up. In less than an hour, the Rubicon specialists and their fiber-optic stockpiles would vanish into the vastness of the Russian interior, resetting the hunt and leaving Ukrainian infantry blind against a threat they couldn't jam. The commander of the Ukrainian Rocket Artillery Division looked at the timestamp. The flight time for a GMLRS rocket from a high-mobility artillery rocket system is roughly 2 minutes and 30 seconds at maximum range. The convoy would be moving in 10. The math was unforgiving. If they launched now, the rockets would arrive while the trucks were stationary. If they waited for a second confirmation, the targets would be mobile, turning a precision strike into a guessing game. At 0218 hours, the firing solution was uploaded to a launcher hidden in a tree line 40 kilometers from the border. The computer didn't care about the reputation of the Rubicon unit or the invincible nature of their fiber-optic technology. It simply processed coordinates, wind speed, and trajectory. The HIMARS system is often described as a sniper rifle for artillery, but that analogy fails to capture the violence of the arrival. A sniper bullet punches a hole. A GMLRS rocket delivers a warhead filled with 180,000 tungsten fragments moving at supersonic speeds. It transforms a grid square into a blender. When the 3 rockets left the rails, they didn't roar like a barrage. They hissed into the sky, climbing to their apogee in seconds. To the Russian radar operators monitoring the airspace, the launch would have appeared as a momentary flicker, a fast-moving contact that looked nothing like a slow drone or a conventional aircraft. By the time their air defense systems could calculate an intercept vector, the rockets were already beginning their terminal dive. The physics of the engagement were absolute. Rubicon unit had spent years perfecting a drone that couldn't be jammed. But they had forgotten that a command center that can be seen is a command center that can be destroyed. Back at the Rubicon facility, the first sign that the equation had shifted wasn't a siren or a radar warning receiver. It was the sound. A GMLRS rocket arriving at Mach 2.5 moves faster than the sound it generates. The impact happens before the brain can register the noise. At 0221 hours, the first rocket slammed into the roof of the main command building. The fuse was set for delayed detonation, allowing the warhead to punch through the concrete reinforcement before exploding inside the operations room. In a microsecond, the tungsten rain shredded the server racks, the control stations, and the specialized fiber-optic spooling equipment that had been terrorizing the front lines. The second rocket impacted the courtyard, turning the idling transport convoy into a chain reaction of exploding fuel and lithium-ion batteries. The third rocket struck the personnel barracks. The invincible engineers who had mocked the concept of electronic warfare were silenced not by a jammer, but by kinetic energy delivered with mathematical precision. The Shark drone circling above recorded the devastation in high-definition thermal video, the heat signature of the base blooming from a dull gray to a blinding white wash that saturated the sensor. The aftermath of the strike revealed the grim reality of the Rubicon unit's hubris. Intelligence assessments later confirmed that the strike had liquidated not just the operational staff, but the senior technical leadership responsible for the fiber-optic program. These were not conscripts who could be replaced with a week of training. These were specialists with years of experience in robotics and signal processing. The loss of the Rubikon Center was equivalent to an Air Force losing its top fighter weapons school in a single afternoon. For the Ukrainian commanders, the strike was a validation of a new doctrine. If you cannot jam the weapon, you must kill the archer. The fiber-optic drones were immune to electronic warfare, but the logistics required to launch them were heavy, slow, and distinct. The spools of fiber, the heavy control units, the specialized vans needed to transport the delicate glass wire. All of these created a physical footprint that no amount of stealth technology could hide. The Rubicon unit had bet everything on the invisibility of their connection, ignoring the visibility of their existence. However, the destruction of the Rubicon HQ was only the opening move in a wider purge. As the smoke cleared over the Kursk border, Ukrainian intelligence began to exploit the sudden silence in the Russian drone network. When a command node is destroyed, subordinate units often break discipline. They turn on radios to ask for orders, they move vehicles to find better reception, they panic. In the hours following the strike, the electronic spectrum, which had been so terrifyingly quiet, suddenly lit up with the chaotic chatter of confused operators. Every transmission was a breadcrumb, and every breadcrumb led to another location. The Rubicon unit had been the head of the snake, but the body was still coiling along the front line. Ukrainian hunter-killer teams, armed with FPV drones and loitering munitions, began to vector in on these new signals. The revenge strike hadn't just removed a single base, it had flushed the entire network into the open. The operators who had spent months laughing at the futility of electronic jamming were now frantically trying to coordinate a retreat over unsecured radio channels, unaware that their panic was providing the targeting data for the next wave of strikes. This shift from a defensive posture to an offensive hunt marked a turning point in the drone war dynamics of early 2026. For months, the narrative had been dominated by the terrifying inevitability of the fiber-optic drone. Soldiers spoke of them in hushed tones, describing the hopelessness of watching a drone approach while their electronic warfare jammers sat useless. But the liquidation of the Rubicon unit shattered that aura of invincibility. It proved that every technological advantage comes with a tactical cost. Fiber-optic tether that made the drones unjammable also limited their range and tethered the operators to a fixed location. To fire the weapon, the Rubicon crews had to sit static, reeling out their glass line, unable to move or evade until the mission was complete. The Ukrainians had realized that this wasn't a strength, it was a fatal vulnerability. They stopped trying to defeat the drone and started hunting the stationary vans and the hidden antennas. The destruction of the Rubicon Center created a logistical shockwave that traveled faster than any fiber-optic signal. Inside the burning wreckage of the command post, something far more valuable than brick and mortar was being consumed by the flames: the proprietary supply chain of the fiber-optic war. The specialized spools of glass filament used in these drones are not off-the-shelf components found in a hardware store. They are precision-engineered microfilaments capable of unspooling at speeds of 100 kilometers per hour without snapping. They require climate-controlled storage and delicate handling, or the glass becomes brittle and useless. The GMLRS strike had not just killed the operators, it had detonated the unit's central stockpile of this critical material. As the fires raged through the storage annex, millions of dollars in specialized optical cable melted into a useless slag of silicon and plastic. The Rubicon unit hadn't just lost its brain, it had lost its nervous system. Without these spools, the surviving field teams were effectively disarmed, Forced to revert to standard radio-controlled drones that the Ukrainian electronic warfare units were already waiting to jam. The math of logistics is often colder than the math of ballistics. A soldier can be replaced in weeks, but a specialized manufacturing supply chain for military-grade fiber optics takes months to rebuild. By 0430 hours, the fires at the Rubikon facility were visible to satellite constellations orbiting 200 kilometers above the Earth. The thermal bloom was so intense that it saturated the sensors of commercial monitoring services, flagging the site as a catastrophic industrial accident. But on the ground, the reality was strictly military. The surviving Russian elements in the sector were now operating in a state of severe information paralysis. The Rubikon Center had acted as a central node for processing the high-bandwidth video feeds that fiber-optic drones provide. These unjammable feeds were the eyes of the Russian artillery in the Kursk sector, allowing for real-time adjustments of fire with perfect clarity. When the center vanished, those screens went black. Artillery batteries that relied on the Rubikon's feeds were suddenly blind, firing at outdated coordinates or ceasing fire entirely to conserve ammunition. The Ukrainian commanders had anticipated this blindness. Within minutes of the strike, Ukrainian assault brigades on the zero line began localized probing attacks, exploiting the sudden lack of enemy reconnaissance. They moved through sectors that had been lethal kill zones only hours before, knowing that the all-seeing eye of the fiber-optic drone was currently blinking smoke and debris. The psychological impact of the strike rippled through the Russian drone operator community with the force of a physical blow. For 2 years, drone operators on both sides had enjoyed a relative degree of safety, launching their birds from hidden basements or dugouts kilometers behind the contact line. But the Rubikon operators were different. They were the elite, the untouchables, who believed their technology placed them above the grim calculus of the trenches. The liquidation of their headquarters shattered this caste system. It demonstrated that no amount of technological sophistication can protect a unit that ignores the fundamentals of operational security. The intercepts picked up by Ukrainian intelligence in the following days painted a picture of deep paranoia. Russian drone teams began refusing to deploy from established positions, fearing that any transmission or any thermal signature would summon another tungsten rain. They spent more time digging and hiding than flying. The efficiency of the Russian drone operations in the sector plummeted by an estimated 40% in the week following the strike, not because of a lack of equipment, but because of a surplus of fear. The operators had realized that while their drones might be invisible to jammers, their bodies were very visible to rockets. This event marked the end of the experimental phase of fiber-optic warfare and the beginning of its industrial attrition phase. The Rubikon unit had been a proof of concept, a specialized scalpel designed to cut through Western electronic defenses. Ukraine's response was to use a sledgehammer. The strike proved that the counter to a high-tech, unjammable weapon isn't necessarily a better jammer. It is often just better intelligence and a bigger explosive. The cat-and-mouse game had evolved. It was no longer about hacking the signal. It was about hunting the logistics. Ukrainian special forces began prioritizing the identification of the specialized transport vans required to move the heavy fiber-optic ground stations. These vehicles, often modified civilian trucks with reinforced suspensions to carry the heavy spools, became high-priority targets for FPV kamikaze drones. The war had shifted from an electronic duel in the ether to a physical hunt on the roads. Every fiber-optic drone launch requires a physical tether to the launch point, a literal line leading back to the operator. The Ukrainians began using high-resolution agricultural drones to scan the tree lines for these thin strands of glass, following the breadcrumbs back to the source. As the sun rose over the smoking ruins of the Rubikon Center on February 3rd, the landscape of the drone war had fundamentally changed. The strike didn't end the threat of fiber-optic drones. The technology is too effective to be abandoned, but it ended the impunity of their operators. It forced the Russians to disperse their assets, breaking up the concentrated expertise of the Rubikon unit into smaller, less effective cells. It increased the friction of war for the invader, forcing them to expend precious time and resources on survival rather than offense. The Rubikon unit had crossed a line in technological warfare, introducing a weapon that bypassed the rules of the electronic spectrum. In response, Ukraine reminded them of the oldest rule of warfare: if you can be found, you can be killed. The elite status of the unit, their specialized patches, and their arrogance were buried under tons of concrete and twisted rebar. At 0445 hours, a solitary KAMAZ Typhoon K armored transport roared out of the tree line onto the P200 highway, its engine straining against the weight of improvised armor. Inside sat the surviving senior engineers of the Rubicon unit, clutching hard drives filled with terabytes of flight data and guidance algorithms. They were running for the deeper rear, believing speed was their armor. But speed is a relative concept when the hunter is loitering 3 kilometers above. A Ukrainian Vampire heavy drone tracked the heat plume of the Typhoon's diesel exhaust, acting as a spotter for a ground team from the 73rd Maritime Center hiding in a drainage ditch 2 kilometers down the road. The operators watched the truck grow in their sights through the optical scope of a Stugna P anti-tank guided missile launcher. The Typhoon was designed to withstand mines, but not a 130mm tandem charge warhead impacting the engine block. The math of the ambush was brutal. A $2 million vehicle carrying $10 million of intellectual property was about to be deleted by a $20,000 missile fired by a carpenter from Lviv. The impact was catastrophic. The Stugna missile didn't just disable the vehicle, it turned the troop compartment into a pressure cooker of spalling metal and overpressure. The driver, blinded by the sudden detonation, jerked the wheel, sending the 20-ton beast rolling into the frozen mud. The fight wasn't over. 2 survivors, dazed and concussed, stumbled from the rear hatch, dragging the last functional fiber-optic control station. In a desperate bid to clear the ambush, they attempted to deploy a drone, their trembling fingers fumbling with the delicate glass spool. It was muscle memory. When under fire, launch the bird. But fiber-optic drones require stillness to launch, a stable platform to ensure the glass thread doesn't snap. As the operator tried to stabilize the unit, the Vampire drone overhead dropped a single fragmentation munition. It wasn't a precision strike calculated by a supercomputer. It was gravity and timing. The bomb fell silently, landing directly between the 2 men. The explosion shredded the control station, and the spool of fiber-optic cable unspooled in the blast, glittering like a spiderweb across the blackened snow. The surviving Russian units in the area dug deeper, stayed quieter, and looked up at the sky with a renewed sense of dread, knowing that the rules of the game had changed again. The invincible Rubicon had been crossed, and on the other side they found only fire.